Hi, welcome to this part of my guide and review featuring the FlexTale Solo Adventuring Toolkit. If you haven't seen the other parts of this guide and review, please check out the playlist in the description below. And for those of you that haven't seen it yet, I have just started a series of videos that will serve as a tutorial to run pre-generated adventures. That is, you can play any adventure that you have purchased or that someone else has designed. That's the point of it, to experience those surprises in the adventure using your party of adventurers as a solo player character or player characters that is controlling an entire party or a single player character. The playlist for that will be in the description. So this time we are going to talk about non-player character interaction in a solo role-playing game by making checks. As always, I am going to be reading to you from the Solo Adventuring Toolkit, and I'm going to give you my thoughts and opinions on this. So, making a check. This is the standard approach, and the one that most closely mirrors what is done in many role-playing games. You perform the following activities in this sequence. You declare your intent, you determine difficulty, you make a check, you determine the degree of success or failure, and then you enact the impacts and consequences. So let's talk about each of these steps or elements of this check procedure. First, you declare your intent. A complete abstract representation of all kinds of interpersonal interactions in the context of a fantasy adventure is somewhat beyond the scope of this book. But here are some general categories of intent that will work well, regardless of how you play the game. So you could try to convince a non-player character, you could threaten a non-player character, you could gather information. Maybe you want to negotiate with that character, perhaps you want to lie or frighten the character, or something else. So yes, it's quite complex when it comes to the interactions with a non-player character, but with this Solo Adventuring Toolkit, in my opinion, because they give you several ways of handling things, and they include that summarized or just like a sort of compact version of the Flex AI guidebook, I think you will find this approach quite satisfactory. After that, you determine difficulty. If you are using a rules system involving difficulty classes, and you are uncertain as to what difficulty class to use, you can use the Flex Table 6 Quick Start difficulty class on page 37 to randomly generate an appropriate target value. You use this table separately for each concept that you wish to test against. Do not, however, reroll on this table for each attempt. That would be quite cumbersome. So, just like any other check or challenge within your game session, you can handle non-player character interactions just like that. So you determine the save or ability. It depends on the game that you are using, the system. If you are playing an OSR system, it's going to be quite different from a more modern role-playing game. And you make your check. This can actually be multiple checks. Perhaps it's a somewhat complex line of questioning. But for the sake of simplicity, let's assume it's a single check. The exact mechanics are left to your rules system of choice, but a general approach is to roll a d20 and compare it to the difficulty involved. Maybe you're playing a system that uses a dice pool, then you need to adapt this to that situation. What skill or ability check is appropriate for a given interaction is best left up to you. But if you feel completely lost as to which check to use, you have a table here telling you about different skills, abilities, saving throws, saving rolls, depending on the system, that you can use to convince, threaten, negotiate, lie, etc., gather information, anything that you wish to attempt with this non-player character. I would recommend that if you are using checks, maybe you can create beforehand a sort of a flowchart or results tables, especially if you are running a pre-generated module. Maybe you have read ahead a bit, that is, you read the paragraph, and then you see that this non-player character is going to help you or hinder you or give you some sort of clue depending on your check. Perhaps you can create a table to determine a random result. So yes, maybe depending on the result and depending on the context, on the events, the flow of the adventure, you can create a table depending on the outcome, perhaps divided by degrees of success based on what you rolled or just handle it as a single check and end up with a single outcome based on the logic of the adventure or the encounter, rather. Then we have information on determining degree of success or failure. Success, failure, impacts, and consequences are all factors in social interactions. Let's define terms quickly to make sure we share a common language before going to the nuts and bolts of how to structure them. Success means you did what you set out to do. Gather information, ally with conviction, etc. Failure means you did not do what you set out to do. That is pretty obvious. Impacts are the effects of success. You receive information you wanted to know, or the guard opens the door to the jail cell because he now believes you are innocent. All of that. It depends on the check, on the situation. And consequences are like impacts but for failure. Perhaps the street card vendor simply doesn't tell you who the local priest truly works for, but maybe instead they walk away angrily. Perhaps the guard ignores you, but perhaps they bonk you on the head with their club. Once you have established which check to use, determined what difficulty that check should be made with, and made that check, you are left with one of 4 possible results: critical failure, failure, success, or critical success. Some rules systems have the determination of this baked into the role involved. For other systems, where only success or failure is determined by a check, you can use a table included in the Solo Adventuring Toolkit to determine further of these results. Once you've made the check and determined if the result is a success or a failure, you roll a further d20 and compare it to the table that I mentioned. If a result says convert to, then the result becomes the indicated new result. No further rolls on this table apply. So, for example, if you got a success in your check, maybe you make a roll in this table and you get a success or a critical success, or if you roll a 1, it converts to a failure. But maybe you failed the roll. You could end up with a critical failure, a simple failure, or if you roll a 20, it actually converts to a success. So if you want a bit more randomness, you could use this table. If you dislike the capacity of turning a success into failure or vice versa, you could choose to ignore that result on the table, of course. Now, concerning impacts, if you've achieved a success or a critical success, there will be impacts associated with your social victory. Ordinarily, you can simply succeed at whatever you were planning on doing with the interaction. If you're looking for something a little more involved and random, you can also roll a d20 and use the table to determine what additional impacts, if any, might apply. You need to use common sense when applying the results from this table. Not everything listed will even make sense in every possible social scenario. So for example, maybe the check was successful and you make your roll and you obtain an achieve partial intent result, or maybe an achieve intent result, or maybe you rolled a 1 and you get achieve partial intent, but attitude degrades. The attitude of the non-player character becomes somewhat more negative. If you obtained a critical success, you make your roll, and maybe you obtain achieve intent, and the attitude of the non-player character improves. Or maybe you achieve your intent, the attitude of the non-player character improves, and you gain advantage on the next check with this non-player character. But if you roll a 1, maybe you only achieve partial intent. Now, when it comes to the non-player character's attitude, results in that table refer to attitude indicating an effect on the way the non-player character with whom you are interacting sees you, or yes, his general attitude towards you. Improves means that the non-player character's attitude towards you improves, of course. Degrades is the opposite. For rule systems that involve a formal concept of attitude, this language works as presented. For other rules systems, or as a replacement for the rules that you are using, you have a table determining the attitude of the non-player character. It's a 5-rank attitude level table. You have enemy, unfavorable, neutral, favorable, and ally. Most non-player characters default to neutral with your party. Characters that share a faction, some sort of religion, or other pre-existing shared social framework, or if your party has already performed a major service of goodwill to the non-player character or the community of that non-player character that is, you can default to favorable in terms of attitude. A result of improving moves the attitude down the list. That is, it becomes more positive, more favorable. And if you obtain degrading, the attitude moves up the list. It becomes more negative towards unfavorable. Then you have consequences. If you've suffered a failure or a critical failure, there will be consequences associated with your social fumble. In most cases, you do not succeed at whatever you were attempting to do. Information is not obtained, people are not convinced, and the bribe fails to produce the desired effect. If you are looking for something a little more involved and random, you can also roll a d20 using a table included in this toolkit. You need to use common sense like in the other case. So maybe you rolled a 1. If you obtained a failure and you roll a 1, the non-player character actually attacks you. But maybe you roll a bit better, the non-player character's attitude degrades and that's it. Or maybe you got lucky and you rolled a 20, then the non-player character stops conversation, that's it. But if you obtained a critical failure, maybe the non-player character attacks you if that non-player character is equivalent or greater in hit dice to you. Or maybe the non-player character flees. Maybe the non-player character's attitude degrades if you rolled a 20. So as you can see, this table also adds a bit more randomness. Now, when it comes to the Flex AI for social encounters, the Flex AI guidebook contains an extensive set of rules governing non-player character behavior in a social encounter as well. I highly recommend that you get the Flex AI guidebook. I think it is currently the best book that you can use to simulate intelligence and artificial intelligence within a solo experience for non-player characters or player characters if you are running things using Abraham's method. The appendix of the Solo Adventuring Toolkit contains an excerpt from the full guidebook focusing on this topic. This appears on page 561. So if you like a more simple approach, use this method of checks that is quite easy to understand. But if you want a bit more detail or granularity, I guess you could also say, definitely use the excerpt on page 561. And this concludes this part of the guide and review. This is a great way of handling checks. It's quite simple and effective. You're not going to get some very complex results, but that's why I recommend that you get the Flex AI guidebook. The summarized version or compact version included in the Solo Adventuring Toolkit will do the job, but for those of us that like to simulate those complex interactions or conversations with non-player characters, it's going to give you a lot more when it comes to the variety of choices, clues, developments within the encounter if you are using the tables of the Flex AI guidebook. So I definitely recommend that you either use the appendix of the Solo Adventuring Toolkit or that you purchase the Flex AI guidebook. It's perfect for social situations and for combat. It's definitely the best AI system for that. Well, unless you are running mass battles, then we will have to wait and see if the war-focused IGS book that is coming out in the near future, I imagine, let's see if that book is also great. So thanks for watching this part of the guide and review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. And thank you so much to those of you that have been supporting the channel by sending drive-thru RPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information on how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you and see you later.